Good evening, Rowan. It's the 25th of January 2016 and it's just after 10:30 and I'm making you another lovely video this evening. I hope you're appreciating all these lovely videos that I'm making for you. I'm sure you are. Anyway, I'm going to make some more comments about your unusual lecture that you gave at the Royal Society of Medicine entitled Sexuality, Sexual Health and Religion Today, and you gave this lecture on the 21st of July 2015. So here's what you say without further ado. In the very challenging and rather unusual language that St. Paul uses in his first letter to the church in Corinth, and for anybody who thinks that St. Paul is just a misogynist, this is a text to reflect on. He is a misogynist, but I think there's a lot more to him as well, in the sense that everybody was in the first century a misogynist, you mean. So, a misogynist is someone who hates women, then. So everybody in the first century was a misogynist. Well, I don't know if you're aware of this. It is actually a little known fact. Not many people know this. But half the people who were alive in the first century were women. Did you know that? So they were all misogynists then. All first century women were misogynists. So really you're betraying your androcentric worldview here, aren't you? Because what you really mean when you say everybody in the first century was a misogynist is that everybody that you consider to be significant in the first century was a misogynist in your view, and the people who you mean by that are high-profile males. Anyway, I don't think that St. Paul was a misogynist. But anyway, you go on to say, I'll say some more about that in a minute. But at one point St. Paul says, the wife's body does not belong to her but to her husband, and you can, as it were, see the heads nodding around his ancient audience. So this is a bit of poetic license here. I'm assuming that you mean that the men were nodding their heads. Presumably in agreement. I think you're implying that they were nodding their heads in agreement, and this would be the men that you were talking about, because the women wouldn't be sitting there nodding their heads in agreement, would they? So you're assuming that first century women were very passive then. Because I suppose the men who were hearing this or reading the letter might be thinking, when St. Paul says the wife's body does not belong to her but to her husband, they might be thinking, I wish. Anyway, I'm going to read this passage in a minute. And then you go on to say, and he then goes on to say that the husband's body does not belong to him but to his wife, which is the point of real shock. Well, how much of a shock would it be, really, when you consider that women in the Gentile world, well, at least around the Mediterranean anyway, in the Roman Empire, had the right to divorce their husbands, which Jewish women didn't at the time. So I think women had more autonomy in the Gentile world in that area, in that period in history, than you're making out, and you're implying that the women of antiquity were very passive, which isn't the case. Certainly not in every instance, anyway. Anyway, I'm going to read this passage now that you're referring to. It's St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 7, beginning at verse 2. Because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a set time, to devote yourselves to prayer, and then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So he's not talking about this as if it was something contentious, really. Otherwise, he would have been likely to give an explanation of why the wife had authority over the husband's body. He doesn't seem to think that this is contentious at all. So I think it's slightly more than poetic license that you're expressing here. I think you're making it up as usual. If it were a contentious issue, he would have gone into much more detailed explanation about it, but he's just mentioned it and given an equal amount of time to it as well. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Well, he hasn't explained that, has he? So he doesn't think it's going to be contentious. Anyway, moving on. You're such a strange man, you really are. So you're saying this is a real point of shock? Well, it doesn't appear to be at all. You go on to say he was saying something so profoundly countercultural in that phrase that people hardly noticed it for centuries. I don't think that that's true either. It was too big to see. But the point there is that he's talking about the marital relationship as he's discussing it. There as communicating something about a mutual giving or dispossessing, a moving beyond the notion of ownership, and that has quite long-term results. One of the things that the Christian church hasn't fully digested until relatively recently. Well, I think you're trying to manipulate me here, to be honest, Rowan, which you usually are. So you're talking about the marital relationship, communicating something about a mutual giving or dispossessing and moving beyond. Well, this lecture was on the 21st of July, and I was forced out of my house on the 9th of July, so this is 12 days after that, and you're saying that the marital relationship that he's discussing is communicating something about a mutual giving or dispossessing and moving beyond the notion of ownership, and that has quite long-term results. One of the things the Christian church hasn't fully digested until relatively recently. Well, it doesn't have long-term results, Rowan. And to be honest, I wouldn't care if it did. You're still not putting your penis in my vagina. And neither is your pretend astrophysical clergy friend. You're absolutely revolting. I wouldn't piss on you if you were on fire. I'd rather live on the bloody street for the rest of my life than have anything to do with a scumbag like you. So you go on to say, so in the Christian context, you do have materials for thinking about sexual well-being and what sexual activity communicates that are more than just a matter of forbidden behaviours. And then you fiddle with your glasses again to indicate this matter of forbidden behaviour isn't true. So the behaviour isn't forbidden, that's what you're saying. Certain sexual activity isn't forbidden, that's what you seem to be saying. Look, Rowan, I don't care if it isn't forbidden anyway. You're revolted. I don't have to make a moral decision about it. You and your filthy pretend astrophysicist of a friend are absolutely revolting. I'd rather die. I don't have to make a moral decision about it, so even if it wasn't forbidden, I don't care. It makes no difference in relation to you. Even if it was positively encouraged, it'd still make no difference. So let's have a look at this again. So in the Christian context, you do have materials for thinking about sexual well-being and what sexual activity communicates that are more than just a matter of forbidden behaviour, fiddle with your glasses, false statements, recommended behaviours and so forth, but are something to do with what you might want to say, what your body communicates, and communicates, of course, inevitably in connection with and mutuality with other bodies, in the plural. Well, that's very interesting, isn't it? Sexual activity is something your body does in connection and mutuality with other bodies. Well, you speak for yourself. Anyway, I'm going to play that clip now. And then I'm going to move on to something even more bizarre that you said in a minute.
Relayed. For example, in the very challenging and rather unusual language that St. Paul uses in his first letter to Corinth. And for anybody who thinks that St. Paul is just a misogynist, this is the text to reflect on. He is a misogynist, but I think there's a lot more to him as well, in the sense that everybody was in the first century. But at one point St. Paul says, the wife's body does not belong to her but to her husband. And you can, as it were, see the heads nodding around his ancient audience. And he then goes on to say, and the husband's body does not belong to him but to his wife, which is the point of real shock. He's saying something so profoundly countercultural in that phrase that people hardly noticed it for centuries. It's too big to see. But the point there is that he's talking about the marital relationship as he's discussing it there, as communicating something about a mutual giving or dispossessing, a moving beyond the whole notion of ownership. And that has quite long-term results. One of those things which the Christian Church has certainly never fully digested until relatively recently. So, in the Christian context, we do have materials for thinking about sexual well-being and what sexual activity communicates that are more than just a matter of forbidden behaviours, recommended behaviours, and so forth, but are something to do with what you might want to say, what your body communicates. And communicates, of course, inevitably in connection with and mutuality with other bodies.
So you go on to say, but Christianity's record of this, as I don't need to remind you, is a bit uneven, and it's something to do with the fact that quite early on Christianity did internalise some very negative attitudes to bodies as such, and therefore to bodily functions like sex. The overvaluation of reason and intellect in some people's writing and thinking in the early church. Then you fiddle with your glasses in the middle, so you think this is a true statement. This meant that sexuality was a deeply problematic area. You never quite knew what was going to happen. And then you go on to say, and St. Augustine has an extraordinarily candid discussion of why this is difficult. You never know, forgive me for being basic, you never know when you're going to get an erection, says St. Augustine. So when I turn up to see your pretend astrophysical clergy friend, he just didn't know that he was going to get an erection. It was all so innocent. I suppose he didn't know that he was going to put his hands in his pockets and start masturbating either. Well, you know what, there's two things to say about this. First of all, when St Augustine makes this statement, he also makes it in the context that a man may not be able to get an erection when he wants one. So it's in the context of impotence as well. So you've missed out half the story just to emphasise that a man never knows when he's going to get an erection. Well, it's quite hard for me to speculate, I suppose, but I'm going to wildly speculate anyway that one is more likely to get an erection if one is thinking about screwing one's parishioners than if one isn't. And particularly when one of them is present with you at that point in time. That's quite an unusual time for a man in his mid-60s to get an erection, wouldn't you say? When he just happens to have a young woman sitting with him. What a coincidence. It's a pity he didn't have the other half of the experience that St Augustine described in relation to this. It's a pity he wasn't struck with impotence at that moment. But unfortunately, he seems to have just got a spontaneous erection for no reason at all. It's just a complete coincidence that he was sat leering at a young woman at the time and saying to me on a pastoral occasion, this is what married life is all about, talking to each other. And shortly after that he's had his hands in his pockets, he was masturbating and leering at me. It was utterly revolting. So you go on to say, your will doesn't manage this side of your experience. Well, to some extent it does. You can control what you're thinking about. And as I've said, I would imagine it's quite unusual for a man in his mid-60s to suddenly get an erection in those circumstances for no reason at all. And then you go on to say, he's talking about men, of course. But again, that's no surprise for the era. You never know what's going to happen. You never know where your body's going to come round and surprise you. And that means that this is a dangerous area. And therefore you need to treat it with enormous caution, and that feeds into a general Western Christian unease. And then you're waving your glasses at the edge again. This is a false statement about all of this. An unease about body, passion and loss of control. Well, the reason that St Augustine was talking about men in this context, as I've said, was because he was talking about it also in the context of being unable to procreate if a man wasn't able to get an erection when he wanted. Which is irrelevant to women, because women can procreate without being sexually aroused. So you haven't quoted this statement, this thing in its correct context. You've just made a point about the unpredictability of getting erections, which I understand is more common amongst teenage boys than 60-odd-year-old men. And as a final point, if you expect me to accept that he just accidentally got an erection and it was all really innocent, which is total bullshit. But prior to this, you'd given a little talk about a Russian author, Dostoevsky, who you've written a book about, and you were talking about a novel that he wrote where one of the characters had to admit to something he hadn't done, had to accept responsibility for a crime he hadn't committed, because that was his offering in an unjust world. So that's another nice try, Rowan. But my contribution in an unjust world is standing my ground and exposing you for the slime ball that you are, so that no one ever believes another word that comes out of your lying mouth. So I'll leave it there for now, but I've got plenty more to say, so don't think I'm going to run out anytime soon. And I know you're bilocating tomorrow, so have a nice day. And which one of your alter egos will I be turning up to arrest? Be alert, both of you. Hasta mañana.
But Christianity's record in this, as I don't need to remind you, is a bit uneven. And it's something to do with the fact that quite early on, Christianity did internalize some very negative attitudes to bodies as such, and therefore to bodily functions like sex. The overvaluation of reason or intellect in some people's writing and thinking in the early church meant that sexuality was a deeply problematic area. You never quite knew what was going to happen. And St. Augustine has an extraordinarily candid discussion of why this is different. You never know, basically, you never know when you're going to get an erection. And your will doesn't manage this side of your experience. Talking about men, of course. Again, no surprise in the era. You never know what's going to happen. You never know quite where your body's going to come round and surprise you. And that means that this is a dangerous area.
When Mitya, accused of a murder he didn't commit, accepts the guilt for the murder because he feels that he has got to take responsibility for a world in which evil happens, and that utterly generous and sacrificial act of taking the blame is his way of doing something for a world of injustice.